Hey everybody, good morning. We're going to start our deep dive right now. What we're going to do is we're just going to keep it relatively informal. We have Tinsley and Stephanie here to answer any questions that you might have about design or learning literacy. We're going to start with Tinsley, and actually Tinsley first wanted to talk about how to make a discoverable interface. So I'll let Tinsley take it away.
Okay. One of the things that I saw as a kind of common theme when reviewing the wireframes was around this issue of of how to design specifically for kids, and actually these design principles are helpful and appropriate in any interface. Kids just tend to drive home the need to be very simple and clear with your interfaces. So there's this concept that I refer to in an interface as being discoverable, which really refers to the idea that the interface can be quickly understood. The best interfaces tend to be very, very simple and have a relatively small number of elements on the screen, and that the way the elements are presented and where they are on the screen gives you some immediate understanding of what they're meant to do. This is particularly true for kids. We have to remember that for the population that we're approaching, that we're talking about, we're trying to teach kids literacy skills, which means they're not literate, obviously. And so we can't rely on a set of instructions that they can read. So there's kind of no point in putting instructions on the screen that tell them what to do. A matter of fact, that can be just a distraction because they're trying to figure out what that is. So the idea that the interface is simple and clear, and if it's immediately understandable, that's great, but that's often not the case. It's often that there's a certain amount of exploration you have to do to understand exactly how it works, which is fine, and then in some cases is actually a bonus with kids, because one of the things you can rely on with kids, which you can't rely on with adults, is that they will explore, that they'll touch anything and everything on the screen in an effort to see what it does and how it does something, even things that you wouldn't expect them to try to touch. So there's kind of two steps to this idea of discoverable. One is, can you look at it and immediately understand as much as you can from it? And two is that what you don't know by looking at it, you can easily find by just touching and seeing what the response is. So there were a number of cases in the wireframes where people put in elements that were probably more geared towards kind of traditional adult user interface, or put instructions on the screen. And I want to kind of encourage people to think about how you can not have those elements in there and still have the interface understandable and discoverable. I gave specific notes on different wireframes, but that's something I wanted to kind of speak directly to. Let me pause there for a second and just see if anybody has any questions. How do we do that? Do we have to unmute them, or do they?
I think they can unmute.
We don't have that many people on, so we can unmute people, right?
Yeah, I sent out a note that if you guys just want to hop in with questions while we're talking, feel free to just shout out the questions. We have a small group today, so.
Somebody just joined?
Yep.
Okay. Sorry.
Actually, can you check to make sure the speakers are on yours?
On this one? Oh, they're not.
There you go.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Well, if anybody said anything, we didn't hear it. So let's try again. Does anybody have any questions?
Nope.
Okay.
Cool.
All right. Well, thank you. Whoever said nope, thank you for that.
Exactly. Yeah. I guess kind of maybe to elaborate a little more on what Tinsley was talking about too. Um, if the interface isn't discoverable per se, you can use visual cues um, to kind of help guide the child. And some of the wireframes we saw, um, things like it would be like a hand that would make a motion. That's a good way to kind of lead a child towards a particular action. So that's worth thinking about as well.
The other, to that note, one of the things you can do too in an interface is kind of stage the understanding of the interface. Which is you leave the interface, you let the child explore, but if there's a certain timeout, then play an animation like that to show where a finger should touch, or highlight something or flash something to try to bring the attention to it, so that what you're doing is supplementing the discoverable nature of the interface as opposed to giving a lot of instruction time up front. And in general, I think this makes a better interface for anybody and everybody, but it's pretty much essential way to do it for kids, particularly kids that are pre-literate. So the other comment I'll say is that those of us that have been using technology for a long time have become habituated to particular icons or interface elements that are part of the kind of language of interface. For example, the square with the X in it to close something, or the play button that is an arrow. And while it can be okay to utilize those things, you do have to remember that for a lot of the kids that we're first reaching, they haven't become enculturated to that nomenclature, and been taught that. So there's not you can't rely on that alone being the tool that tells the kid what they should do, right? You have to supplement it with something else. You have to basically train them into that. One of the examples I like to use of this in the interface is that I did a multi-touch interface before the iPhone came out, and we specifically were doing an interface where we wanted people to be able to zoom in on photos, and we actually had implemented the two-touch zoom, and tested it and found that people didn't know what to do with it, right? And so we ended up using a different interface because of that. And then Apple came out with the iPhone and spent tens of millions of dollars advertising it, training people how to use two fingers to pinch and pull a photo to enlarge it. And now we have 2-year-olds that are trying to pinch and pull photos on magazines. Yep. So there's that kind of evolution that happens in user interfaces that gets embedded in our kind of in the language of interaction. And what's unusual is that when you're working with kids, particularly kids in developing countries, that they haven't developed that language yet. So you have to be sensitive to helping them understand that if you're using those elements. Okay.
Cool. I guess, does anybody have any app design related questions for Tinsley that you'd like to ask? Cool. Well, we're going to have kind of an open Q&A at the end, but I guess we're going to turn it over to Stephanie right now. So go for it, Stephanie.
Okay, what am I talking about again?
How do you use
Using animated characters. Yeah, so I just wanted to bring up, there actually aren't very many of you who decided, at least at this stage, to put in a character. And maybe that's going to come in at a later stage. And if that's the case, I just wanted to introduce some thoughts as you think about whether or not a character would be useful. And what we've typically seen in apps that are designed for kids is that oftentimes a character is brought in, say for instance at the beginning of the game, to serve kind of the role that Tinsley was just touching on. This notion that, you know, a character comes in and says, hey, boys and girls, this is what we're going to do today, kind of thing. Well, our data from across the world has told us that that is a big turnoff for kids. That, you know, especially young children who oftentimes aren't English speakers and who may be using this app to learn English vocabulary don't really have the patience to sit and listen to some character that they don't really understand. But they do seem to respond positively to having a character that either is really deeply embedded in the game, so the character is kind of is a major participant in the game somehow, and in essence acts like a peer. So it's as if the character and the child are kind of on this learning journey together, and either the character serves the role of telling the child that, yay, you did something great, or, you know, gives the maybe negative feedback like, oh, let's try that again, which actually is somewhat more of a teacherly role. Or what we've also been exploring in some other projects is whether or not the character could serve the role of being the one that needs to be taught. So the child maybe is made to feel like, you know, you maybe know a little bit more than I do, so teach me how this works. I do think, you know, you certainly can feel free to make a game that doesn't have any kind of characters at all. But if you do think that a character would add something to your game, I want you to think very, very critically about what role that character would play. And I invite you to use your own creativity to think about what that character could add to the game. Maybe you'll come up with an idea that, you know, that we haven't thought of, and we'd love to entertain those ideas. But I would strongly advise against having a character that's either in a teacher role or in a I'm here to tell you all about the game role. Because we just don't think that we don't have any evidence that those are roles that interest kids at all.
So actually I have a question about that, Stephanie. So if you had an interface that you were trying to explain visually, could you use a character to kind of say, you know, I wonder what would happen if I touched this lever, and then walk over to the lever and then touch the lever? Is that kind of too much of the teacher role, or is if you...
No, I think that actually is a great example of a character who is acting like a peer.
Yeah.
So you could imagine two kids on the playground, you know, looking at, I don't know, a shovel or looking at a toy and discussing whether or not, you know, they were going to play with the toy. And one of them would be the brave one to say, ooh, I'm going to go over and I'm going to start pushing it around.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's what you're describing is kind of that same child interaction. So you've got a character on the screen that says, ooh, there's something over there to do. I'm going to be the brave one and I'm going to go do it first.
Yeah.
And that, I think that's an excellent way to model how the game works, but to keep the child engaged, to show them that, you know, here's what you have to do, and you can kind of shortcut a little bit the exploration phase. But you don't just have a character standing up saying blah, 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 here we are, boys and girls, this is what we're going to do.
Like one note on that is that like that particular example you gave, you could imagine an alternative solution, which is that the lever actually just kind of wiggles to get the kid's attention, right? And so that's a solution that doesn't require having written the code to animate a character, having produced the frames, going through that whole process, right?
Yep.
So, I think do realize that when you're putting a character into an app, you're taking on a rather substantial production and coding burden to do that. So I think you want to be very careful about whether you do that, whether it really serves your needs, and serves a critical part of the user interface that can't be fulfilled some other way.
Exactly.
And that the type of animation that you're doing for that character is probably as lightweight as you can be.
Yeah, absolutely.
Otherwise, you're actually taking on probably a lot more production work than you realize.
Yep, and it's kind of in these apps. It's really good to kind of focus on simplicity, I was going to say for these animated characters in week 3, Micah has kind of written up some instructions on using. We have a component called Animated Sprite, which you guys will kind of be able to play around with, along with kind of some animated characters that we've created for our own games. So in week 3, next week, you'll be able to kind of see how all that works.
This, I will say on a kind of general interface design note that this kind of hits upon the desire for kind of simplicity, which speaks to this notion of everything that we've talked about today, which is that we, particularly as engineers, we tend to think about, how many features can we put in something, and wouldn't it be great if I had added this feature and that feature and that feature, and that's going to make it richer and better. And what's generally the case in good user interface design is that the less is in it, and the more it still fulfills all the functional needs, the better it is. So the simpler, the better.
Yeah.
The more, obvious it is. So good interface design, I find, is much more about what you leave out instead of what you put in. That it's a constant triage of, do I really need this? Is there a way I can do it differently? Can I have less elements? Can it unfold in a different way as somebody interacts with it? Can I not have a modal quality to it where I'm moving between modes and the user's forced to remember what mode they're in, right?
Yeah.
So how do you refine it and become very simple? I often like to say that as a designer, I've done my job if the user thinks I've never done anything, right? That it's so self-evident that why would you consider doing it any other way, right? That the user doesn't know or appreciate any of the long, hard, grueling work I did.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Cool. And kind of to that point, in weeks 3 and 4, you'll actually be building a very rough version of your workshop project that you will be doing a usability study with. And I think kind of at that point, you will be able to figure out kind of, strike that balance that Tinsley's talking about between keeping the user engaged, but also keeping them on task. Great. I guess I'd open it up to any questions for Stephanie about characters.
Any questions on anything?
On
Yeah, anything, yeah.
Although I want to interrupt for 1 second, Ben. And for many of you, I've made some notes in your probably most likely in the project goal document about little things like be more clear about what words you're going to use or what letters you're going to use or how you're going to classify words. And I understand, we're in this workshop, not going to be creating necessarily a full-fledged game that has to have hundreds and hundreds of stimuli. But I just want to see a little bit of evidence in your goals, in your project goals, that you've thought about, what grouping, what aspect of language, but something more specific than just saying, I'm going to teach kids letters, or I'm going to teach kids words. For instance, if your game is designed to teach vocabulary, are you going to structure your game around teaching kids the vocabulary in of items in their home? Or is it going to be farm animals? Or is it going to be animals in the zoo? Or is it stuff at school? Just some notion that you have really spent some time thinking, or spent a little bit of time thinking about how I would group the content. I don't want you to spend too much time on it, but a lot of games out there may be really well designed, but where they fall apart is how they, what kinds of stimuli they use. And so I just want to be able to give you some guidance on that front.
Yeah, and to kind of elaborate a little more, we will be, in week 5, we will be providing JSON files that include the words. With the JSON files, you are free to plug your own words in or kind of use our suggested words, but it is a good exercise, as Stephanie was mentioning, to kind of think about kind of the scope and sequence of what words you want to teach a child. You know, you can't go from cat to
anti-disestablishmentarianism.
exactly. Or you could, but would it stick?
Probably
questionable.
not.
Questionable.
Probably not. I'd like to see a picture of that anti-disestablishmentarianism.
Yep. That's going in someone's project.
Yeah, there you go. There you go.
Cool. I think that's it for all the topics that we wanted to discuss. We'd like to open kind of the floor to everyone for questions. Unfortunately, we don't have Micah here today for React Native questions, but even if you want to ask a React Native question, we can collect those now to be answered kind of directly.
Hello?
Hello.
Hey.
Hi.
Hey, Eric. How's it going?
Erica. So I guess I have a question. I was wondering whether you have any favorite apps out there that are good examples of either design or, you know, keeping students engaged or at least not distracted, and that might serve as kind of either inspiration or good examples for us to kind of see.
Yep. No, that's a great question. Just good example. I mean, I actually, ironically,
Bad
think,
examples would probably be helpful too.
yeah, bad examples are very helpful. But I would
be great.
Yeah, I can draw up a list of those kinds of apps. I would say off the top of my head, actually a really great example, I think, of both design as well as engagement is Angry Birds. I mean, there's no doubt that Angry Birds is very engaging. Kids play it for hours and hours and hours. And also, it's a great example of how there is no real need, or there's very little need for any kind of instruction as to how the game is played. It's a very widely discoverable interface. Now, in terms of literacy games that I think are well designed, there is a set of games made by a company called Adoki Academy, and in particular their game, The Joy of Reading, is a really good example of a game that's very well structured in terms of its scope and sequence. Not necessarily all the games are super engaging, although I do like the fact that they have very little, if any, explanation as to how the game is played.
And is that for Android or iOS or both? Or
that is for both.
great.
And there's a set of free apps out there that are unfortunately only for iOS. They're not for Android, but they're called Oz, O-Z, so just like the Wizard of Oz, Oz Phonics, and that's another great example of a game that has a very highly structured and systematic scope and sequence, and actually has some fairly interesting games too.
Tokuboka stuff's pretty good.
Tokuboka stuff is a great example also of very engaging, very well designed kids
And
apps.
it's a pretty good job of being discoverable. They do lean at times on, they have really high production values. They clearly have really good character designers and animators, and they do rely on that sometimes. And that sometimes masks some interface issues. But their stuff's worth looking at.
And then another education game that is not in the literacy front that we've seen kids be incredibly engaged in a really productive way is called Slice Fractions. And I've seen kids, in the middle of South Africa play a screen over and over and over and over again because they are determined to solve such and such a question, and the design is just so engaging that the kids are just willing to hack away at it forever.
I think that speaks to, if you look at Slice Fractions and Angry Birds, both of those are apps that are effectively built upon one interaction mechanic. It happens to be an interaction mechanic that just has really been refined and works really well. And it shows the power of creating one really good, strong interaction mechanic and getting that tuned and perfect, and how extensively you can exploit that once you've done that. So, and that's really what you're being asked to do with the very first prototype, is to mock up just that interaction mechanic. Not every aspect of the interface, not the whole start to finish, but it's really, what is that core interaction mechanic, and is that working for kids? Is it discoverable? Is it understandable? And is it fun? Right. Does that help?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks.
No problem. Great. Does anyone else have any other questions? If not, we're always available on the Slack channels.
And there's also office hours if folks want.
Yeah.
If folks want to talk more specifically about their project, or just are more comfortable not speaking in front of the group, then sign up for a slot in the office hours.
Yep. You can find the office hours are in the syllabus, but also feel free to just ping me on Slack, and I can point you to all the instructors' office hour pages. Great. Well, I think if we're all out of questions, thanks everyone for joining the deep dive. I hope this was helpful for you guys, and hope you're doing well with the week 2 assignments.